Senator Ted Cruz says that acquiring Greenland is overwhelmingly in America's first national interest. And the Texas senator joins us now to explain. You know, Senator, I said last night that, you know, a lot of people, you would think after 11 years on the world stage, people might have figured out Donald Trump a little bit. Certainly we have. We understand him. He's in a perpetual state of negotiation. I mean, that's the beauty of Donald Trump. And I said last night, and the president had mentioned this, that maybe $100,000 to every person in Greenland to start. Yep. And America is uniquely qualified. They have vast natural resources and rare earth. We would be in the best position to help them extract these natural resources that they can have a profit share in. I could make an argument that every person in Greenland who only gets $10,000 a year from Denmark could be a multi-millionaire if American ingenuity were ever unleashed in Greenland. Do you agree?
I very much agree. I think there's a very strong argument that there is a win-win agreement to be negotiated here. President Trump is exactly right that it is overwhelmingly in the national security interest and the economic interest of America to acquire Greenland. Economically, they have vast rare earth minerals and critical minerals there that are incredibly important both to our economy and our national defense. And then from national security, Greenland's location on the Arctic is vitally important, especially with both China and Russia getting more and more active and aggressive in the Arctic. You look at President Trump's Golden Dome initiative to intercept missiles aimed at the United States. Those missiles would very likely go over the Arctic. Greenland is ideally located to play an integral part of that. And so on the merits, it makes a great deal of sense. Now, the question is, how is this going to happen? And I think the answer is it is going to happen with a voluntarily negotiated acquisition. I don't believe it is going to be by military force. I think it's going to be a negotiation between friends and allies. That's what President Trump is doing. And as you know, there's a long history. The media acts like there's something bizarre and unusual about the notion of acquiring territory. If you go back to Thomas Jefferson, one of our very first presidents, he signed the Louisiana Purchase, purchasing about half of what is today the United States. You look at our buying Alaska from Russia. At the time, it was called Seward's Folly. The Secretary of State, William Seward, advocated that. A lot of people don't know. Seward also advocated back then, at the same time that we acquired Alaska, Seward advocated acquiring Greenland. By the way, that has continued for years. Harry S. Truman, a Democrat, not only wanted to acquire Greenland, he put an offer of $100 million to purchase Greenland. It was not successful. But what Donald Trump is doing is using his negotiating skills to try to move forward. And I think it is very much in the interest of the United States, but I think it's also in the interest of the people of Greenland. So I think there's a win-win that's here.
All right. And there's something that we have to face here, and that is that NATO, without the military power and might of this country, frankly, are a paper tiger. President Xi doesn't fear them. Vladimir Putin doesn't fear them. With the United States, there is real fear, real worry, and real concern. The ironic part of this, you know, watching NATO allies and Western European leaders attack the president, they would be the biggest beneficiary of the strongest U.S. military presence in Greenland than anybody. It would benefit them way more than it would even benefit the United States, would it not?
Absolutely. And you're right that there has been problem for a long time of the Europeans taking America for granted. It's one of the things President Trump has taken the lead on, is getting the Europeans to invest more in their own defense, to contribute more to NATO rather than just being dependent on the United States. But listen, I'm a big supporter of NATO. I think that NATO has been the most successful alliance of modern times. I think it is incredibly important. But I also believe that the U.S. acquiring Greenland is good for NATO. Look, we're not seeing Europe use Greenland to make it a major military defense point. The United States would. And so NATO would be safer if and when the United States acquires Greenland. And so you're going to hear a lot of complaining, but you and I both know President Trump very, very well. At this point, his negotiating style is not a secret. His negotiating style is he whacks someone upside the head with a 2x4, and then he negotiates from there. And we're watching that unfold right now. I think the objective here is to negotiate a purchase. I believe that's going to happen. You know, I had the Danish ambassador and Greenland's ambassador come to my office, and they were freaked out saying, are y'all going to invade us? And I said, no, we're not going to invade you. But there is a win-win that is in your interest, and the president is going to use every tool he has to advance that. I think we're seeing that unfold right now.
And it would be in their best interest financially. It would be in the best interest of Europe.
Yes.
And let's see how long it takes Europe to wake up.
Europe would be safer.
President Trump. They'd be safer. Well, they were against President Trump's tariffs.
Yeah.
They were against President Trump insisting they pay their fair share with NATO. They were whining and screaming, and then they gave in. I suspect that'll happen this time. Senator, thank you. Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.